Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John Montgomery. Today we've got a game from Tani Adewumi. As you know, he is a 10-year-old master. He was a Nigerian refugee with a great story. And the game we're going to go over today is a game against International Master Justin Sarkar. And recently this game was reviewed and critiqued by none other than Garry Kasparov himself. Tani was working with Kasparov as one of the top young talents. And this is really a terrific game, and I hope you enjoy it. Tani has the black pieces. Justin Sarkar has the white pieces. It begins with d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, castling bishop e3. So we have a King's Indian defense, and this bishop to e3 move is sort of a restrained version of the Averbach variation, where the bishop might normally go to g5, but in this case it just goes to e3. d6, bishop e2, knight to c6. Now, some very high-rated players have played this way with black, including Daniel Dubov. But when he played this way, he lost to Nepomniachtchi. But Ray Robson did beat Sam Sevian with it. The move knight to c6 aims at the d4 pawn directly. White plays knight f3, and this transposes into a Gligorich system, where white wants to maintain a fluid center. Black plays knight to g4. He wants to take that dark squared bishop at e3 off of the board. It's a very important minor piece for white. He also wants to unblock his f-pawn so he can advance that pawn. Bishop g5, he doesn't want it to be captured. h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop to g3. Black chases the bishop, gains some space on the king side, but also that king side structure is now a little bit vulnerable, and those pawns can become a target even though he has gained space. e5, striking in the center, he wants to get his share of space. White has all of that space, black wants some of it back. And he also is targeting that d4 pawn. The knight at c6, the e5 pawn, and the bishop at g7 all attack d4. It's the thematic move. d5, knight to d4, jumping into the center of the board and getting ready to launch the f-pawn. h4, trying to take advantage of the space black has gained, that h6, g5 structure. Maybe he can create a weakness and take advantage of it. Black plows ahead with f5, pawn takes pawn, and then Tani plays f4. Very aggressive move. It really isn't the best move in this position. He should have gone ahead and just taken the pawn at g5, as like so. ef5, bishop f5, and black has a good position, certainly playable position. f4 is very aggressive, but after bishop to h4, the pawn is protected, and white is better here. So the International Master Justin Sarkar does have a better position than black at this point. He's up a pawn. But Tani has active pieces, and his king is in the middle of the board, so he has real practical chances. You know, in a position like this, white has to answer the question, where am I going to put my king? And it's a question that his opponent struggles to answer during the entire game. Be sure to put in the comments section, how much material would you be willing to sacrifice to keep your opponent's king in the middle of the board? First of all, h5 to support the knight at g4. White plays knight h2. He wants to trade off that strong knight at g4. It's well posted. Tani doesn't exchange it off. Instead, he plays queen to d7. He supports the knight at g4. He wants to keep it there, and if white takes it, he'll take with the pawn. Knight to f1. What white wants to do is play the pawn to f3, hitting the g4 knight, and then if the knight tries to jump into e3, that knight at f1 can capture it, and then maybe white could play queen d3 and queen takes pawn. a6. So Tani is operating under that strategic idea we talked about. Where is white going to put his king? So he's got space on the king side. Now he wants to gain space and open up lines on the queen side, so that king has to stay in the middle of the board, and he can really target that space, target that king in the middle where he is most vulnerable. f3, continuing with his plan. Knight jumps into e3, knight e3, fe3, queen to d3. So white wants to take that pawn on e3, but he can't do it right away, because if he takes it right away, black's knight on d4, such a well-posted knight, pops into c2 and forks the king and the queen, so he can't do it yet. Black plays b5, continuing his expansion on the queen side, trying to gain space, trying to open up lines there. Rook to c1. White doesn't want to open up lines. He doesn't want to exchange pawns and open up those lines for attack. He's saying if lines are going to be opened, black is going to have to spend the tempo to do it. But black plays b4, hitting that knight at c3 and forcing it to the back rank. It can't go anywhere because to a4 the queen would take it. So now the knight has to go to the back rank. Black's queen goes to a4, hitting that pawn on a2. White plays queen to b1, defending the a2 pawn, and it turns out this is a mistake. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. What white should have done, and this is hard to see, is play queen takes e3. And the reason this is such a hard idea to see is because it allows that knight to go to c2 with check, forcing white to give up the exchange with rook captures c2 and queen captures c2. But the computers show us that in this position after g6, the threat of moving the queen to g5, taking that pawn on h5 and hitting the h7 square, queen h7 check or even mate, is overpowering, and it leads to a completely dominating position for white. If black tried to block the queen's access to g5 by, say, playing rook to f4, then white just plays g3, and if he takes the bishop, rook takes, and the game would essentially be over at that point. So that was a missed opportunity by the International Master. He played the more passive move, queen to b1. Tani continues to open up lines of attack, b3. Now, white is still better. White has an extra pawn, and he has space. But Tani Adewumi is constantly forcing Justin Sarkar to answer difficult questions and do it with his king in the middle of the board. And when you continually ask tough questions of your opponent, eventually most people will answer one of those questions incorrectly. White takes the pawn, knight takes, hitting the rook at c1. The rook gets out of avoids the threat, and also puts some pressure on that e3 pawn. He wants to recapture that and get rid of it. Rook to b8, moving the rook to the half-open b file. Knight takes e3. Now, white is up 2 pawns and has a large advantage here. Tani does not have a great position, but again, tough practical questions. He moves his knight back to d4. Very well placed knight. White plays the bishop to d1. Hitting the queen on a4. He doesn't want black to be able to take that bishop with his knight. The queen goes to b4. Now, after all the pressure of having the king in the middle of the board, white blunders in a better position. White has the better position, but here he makes a mistake. He castles. Can you see why that's a mistake? Pause it for a second if you want to analyze the position and be able to figure out why this is a blunder. That's right. It's a blunder because there is a pin along the b file. Queen takes rook. Pawn takes queen, rook takes queen. And now he hasn't won a whole rook because he captures the pawn on the knight on d4 with a pawn, but he has won an exchange, and after ed4, Tani Adewumi, after all of that, is now in complete control of the position. White plays the knight to f5, bishop takes f5, e takes f5, rook takes f5. Now black has recovered the 2 pawns he was down and still has an exchange of a rook for a bishop. White plays bishop to c2. Now this looks like it actually is going to win the game because it's double attacking the rook at b1 and the rook at f5. But Tani is able to play rook to f1 with check and now black has to recapture that rook at f1, and now he just happily moves the rook at f5 away, and it is no longer threatened. Now what white wants to do, get some counterplay, is advance that f and g pawn forward with those two bishops and try to generate some counterplay. But Tani shows very nice technique here. He begins by playing rook to e3. White plays f5, getting those two pawns on the 5th rank side by side, which are strong. Tani plays d3, forcing that bishop back to d1 and making sure it doesn't defend that f5 pawn or control those key light squares around the black king. And then bishop to c3. He knows white wants to play f6 and block that dark squared bishop out. So he gets it out of from in front of those pawns right now, so white won't be able to block them. White goes ahead and plays f6. Then black plays d2. And in this position, white resigned. The threat of rook to e1 is so serious. If black plays rook e1, the bishop at h4 captures that rook, then the pawn would take and promote to a queen, leading to a decisive advantage. The only real possibility white would have would be bishop to e2, blocking black's access to that e1 square, but then he could just play a5, and the threat of the pawn advancing and queening would be decisive. So another great game by Tani Adewumi, this time beating an international master. I'm really looking forward to watching this young prodigy's progress. Thanks for joining us at Chess Dog.